Welcome back. Missed you guys last week. This is a...
Did you teach by yourself or something?
I taught by myself, that's it exactly. No one was here. This is a big week, so I want to cut right to the chase and jump right in. From here on out, we got done last time we were together, we got done with the section on apologetics. So from here on out, we're going to assume that Christianity is true. Nice assumption. So we're jumping into the book on, Lewis's book on morality or Christian behavior. And just to kind of give you guys a heads up, the first two chapters are the three parts of morality. And then the second chapter is the Cardinal Virtues. And I think those two chapters pair very nicely together. Chapter 3 doesn't really fit with them. And it also doesn't really fit with next week. When I was putting together my lessons, it didn't fit well. So we have two chapters that pair nicely and then kind of a third, redheaded child. So.
What's wrong with redheaded child?
So, Lewis begins on chapter 1 of Three Parts of Morality with a story. He says, I once heard about a schoolboy who was asked what he thought God was like. And he thought about it for a minute and responded, God seems like this kind of person who's always snooping around, looking to see if anybody's having a good time, and then trying to stop it. Lewis says, this is the taste that the word morality leaves in a lot of people's mouths. All right? Something that gets in the way of having a good time. Lewis says, really, morality are the rules for running the human machine. They're the rules that are there to prevent any kind of strain or friction, right? Anything that might cause a breakdown in humans. He says, whenever you're learning a new machine, your instructor's going to keep telling you, nope, don't do it like that, right? Because you're doing things that seem okay to you, but really it's not how the machine works, all right? Morality's the same way. And it's also why it seems contrary to a lot of our natural inclination. We don't know. It seems like it should work that way to us. So, jump into it. Lewis says there's two ways that humans can go wrong. The first is, you might imagine that they, in a sense, collide with each other or cause damage to each other. And you see that in, cheating or being unkind. The other way is when the internal workings inside a person goes wrong. Lewis says, let's use this analogy. Imagine a fleet of ships, all sailing in formation on a convoy. All right, the voyage is only a success when two things happen. One, none of the ships run into each other. And two, all the ships remain seaworthy. All their sails or engines, the ships aren't leaking. Their steering mechanisms aren't all out of wonk. But the next thing to note is that the two things require each other. If one fails, so does the other. If a ship's steering mechanism and its engines aren't working properly, they're not going to be able to help but run into each other. And if the ships are running into each other, they're not going to remain seaworthy for very long. But there's a third thing here that we haven't talked about, which is, where are we going? The voyage would be a failure if the ships were meant to sail to New York and ended up in Sydney. So really, morality seems to be concerned with three things. First is, let's say, the harmony between individuals. Second is let's say, properly functioning individual, all your internal mechanisms working properly. And third, whatever the goal is that we're going towards. Now, Lewis says, modern people seem to really only think about number one, harmony between individuals, and forget about 2 and 3. They think about striving for kindness and respect and fair play between nations and classes and individuals. Now that's all having to do with the first thing, harmony between individuals. People are only thinking of the first thing when they say, it can't be wrong because it doesn't do anyone else any harm. Right? And Lewis says it's natural to start at number 1. Right? Things that are against number one, harmony between individuals, are really obvious to us. Right? They press in on us every day. Examples are war and poverty and lies. And there's very little disagreement that we ought to be fair and that we ought to be kind. But what is the good of telling the ships to avoid collisions when the mechanisms falling apart inside are so bad that they can't be steered? They can't help but collide with each other. Lewis says, what's the good of writing rules on social behavior when we know that our greed, our cowardice, our bad temper, and our conceit are going to prevent us from keeping them? I do not mean for a moment that we ought not to think, and think hard, about improvements to our social and economic systems. What I do mean is that all that thinking will be mere moonshine unless we realize that nothing but the courage and unselfishness of individuals is ever going to make any system work properly. It is easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft or bullying that go on under the present system. But as long as men are twisters or bullies, they will find some new way of carrying on the old game under the new system. You cannot make men good by law, and without good men, you cannot have a good society. That is why we must go on to think of the second thing, the morality inside the individual. But we can't stop there. Different beliefs about the universe lead to different behaviors. Some people say, no, we should stop before we get there. Let's just go on with the stuff that we all agree on. But Christianity, and really all religions and all worldviews, assert facts that must either be true or false. And if true, you should draw one conclusion, and therefore one behavior, and if false, a different behavior. For example, let us go back to the man who says that a thing cannot be wrong unless it hurts some other human being. He quite understands that he must not damage the other ships in the convoy, but he honestly thinks that what he does to his own ship is simply his own business. But does it not make a great difference whether his ship is his own property or not? Does it not make a great difference whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my own mind and body, or only a tenant responsible to the real landlord? If somebody else made me, for his own purposes, then I shall have a lot of duties which I should not have if I simply belonged to myself. Another way to look at it. Christians think that people are going to live forever. Now, there may be a great deal many things that you don't need to worry about if you were only going to live 80 years. Perhaps your temper is slowly getting worse. In fact, so slowly that in 80 years you wouldn't even notice. But after an eternity, it would be absolute hell. In fact, hell is the precisely correct technical term for it. Or you can look at the state. If individuals only last 70 or 80 years, then obviously nations or civilizations or enterprises, which can last hundreds of years, are more important. But if people live forever, then not only are they more important, but they are infinitely more important. So that's chapter 1, the 3 parts of morality. They are harmony between individuals, the properly functioning individual, and then the third thing is, let's say, the relationship between man and whatever made him. Before I jump into chapter 2, are there any questions? Thoughts? Okay. Now, chapter 2, the Cardinal Virtues, was originally not given as a talk on the air. It was added in later when he actually wrote the book. He started with chapter 1 on the air as a way to explain morality as best he could. When you only have 10 minutes to talk on the radio, he says pretty much everything has to be sacrificed for brevity. But we're going to go over a way that the early Christians broke up morality. They broke up morality into 7 virtues, 4 cardinal virtues, and 3 spiritual or theological virtues. The 3 theological virtues are faith, hope, and love, and we're going to cover them in depth in later chapters. But today we're going to cover the cardinal virtues briefly. Now, cardinal doesn't have anything to do with birds, doesn't have anything to do with Catholic clergy. It comes from Latin meaning a door hinge, right? These are the pivotal virtues. These are the virtues that the apostles thought all civilized people would acknowledge, right? Maybe only Christians think about the spiritual virtues, but everyone should acknowledge, if they're civilized, the cardinal virtues. They are prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. Now, we're going to break these down a little bit because a lot of those are kind of old-fashioned words. Prudence is the first cardinal virtue, and it just means thinking things out. Common sense, right? Being prudent. Now, most people don't really think of that as being a virtue. And there's even some confusion among Christians because Christ said that we should be like children. Well, first, if you've actually raised children or worked with children, you'll know that children actually are really prudent about things that they're really interested in. You can watch the gears turning as they really parse things through. Second, Lewis says, as St. Paul points out, Christ never meant that we were to remain children in intelligence. On the contrary, he told us to be not only as harmless as doves, but as wise as serpents. He wants a child's heart, but a grown-up's head. He wants us to be simple, single-minded, affectionate, and teachable, as good children are. But he also wants every bit of intelligence we have to be alert, at its job, and in first-class fighting trim. The fact that you are giving money to a charity does not mean that you need not try to find out whether that charity is a fraud or not. The fact that what you're thinking about is God himself, for example when you're praying, does not mean that you can be content with the same babyish ideas which you had when you were a 5-year-old. It is, of course, quite true that God will not love you any less, or have any less use for you, if you happen to have been born with a very second-rate brain. He has room for people with very little sense, but he wants everyone to use what sense they have. If you are thinking of becoming a Christian, I warn you, you are embarking on something which is going to take the whole of you, brains and all. But fortunately, it works the other way round. Anyone who is honestly trying to be a Christian will soon find his intelligence being sharpened. One of the reasons why it needs no special education to be a Christian is that Christianity is an education itself. That is why an uneducated believer like Bunyan was able to write a book that has astonished the whole world. Bunyan wrote Pilgrim's Progress. So, prudence, thinking things through. The second cardinal virtue is temperance. And temperance is a word that has changed its meaning over time. Nowadays, if people use it at all, it usually refers to abstaining from drinking. But originally, it didn't have to do with alcohol, but all pleasures. And it didn't mean abstaining, but taking a pleasure the right amount. In an earlier chapter, we talked about evil being the pursuit of something good, pleasure or safety or power, in the wrong way, or at the wrong time, or too much. So in that sense, in just that sense, temperance is the opposite of that. Lewis says, really quickly about alcohol, it may be the duty of a particular Christian, or of any Christian at a particular time, to abstain from strong drink, either because he is the sort of man who cannot drink at all without drinking too much, or because he is with people who are inclined to drunkenness and must not be encouraged by drinking himself. But the whole point is that he is abstaining for a good reason from something which he does not condemn, and which he likes to see other people enjoying. One of the marks of a certain type of bad man is that he cannot give up a thing himself without wanting everyone else to give it up too. That is not the Christian way. An individual Christian may see fit to give up all sorts of things for special reasons. Marriage, or meat, or beer, or the cinema. But the moment he starts saying the things are bad in themselves, or looking down his nose at other people who do use them, he has taken the wrong turn. Now, intemperance, that is, not the vice of not being temperate, can be any pleasure. Lewis says, a man who devotes all of his thought to golf or his motorcycle, or a woman who devotes all her thoughts to clothes or her dog, are being just as intemperate as someone who gets drunk and falls down in the middle of the road every night. Now, it's true that golf mania and clothes mania don't make you fall down in the middle of the road. But it's important to remember that God is not deceived by externals. Right? He knows how intemperate you are, even if we don't. Justice is the third cardinal virtue. And it includes both the police court sense, but it also includes all kinds of fair play. Honesty, telling the truth, keeping your promises, sincerely seeking compromise. Fortitude is the last cardinal virtue, and it means courage or perseverance. So it means both kinds. It means standing up in the face of fear or in the face of the unknown, but it also means the ability to stick it under pain, keep going after years of disappointment and discouragement. And the important thing to note about fortitude is really it's just all the other virtues practiced over time. If you're going to be temperate, but you're only going to be temperate today and not tomorrow or next week or next month, then you're not really being temperate. If you're going to be just, but you're only just today and not tomorrow or next month, then you're not practicing fortitude. And now, really quickly, we're going to look at the difference between doing a virtuous act, doing something good, and being a virtuous or being a good person. There's a difference between doing some particular just or temperate action and being a just or temperate man. All right. For example, someone who is not a good tennis player may now and then make a good shot. What you mean by a good player is a man whose eye and muscles and nerves have been so trained by making innumerable good shots that they can now be relied on. They have a certain tone or quality, which is there even when he is not playing. In the same way, a man who perseveres in doing just action gets in the end a certain quality of character. This distinction is important for the following reasons. 1, we might think that provided you did the right thing, it does not matter how or why you did it. Whether you did it willingly or unwillingly, sulkily or cheerfully, through fear of public opinion or for its own sake. But the truth is that right actions done for the wrong reasons do not help to build the internal quality or character called a virtue. Go back to the tennis analogy. If a bad tennis player hits very hard, not because he sees that a very hard stroke is required, but because he has lost his temper, his stroke might possibly, by luck, help him to win that particular game. But it will not be helping him to become a reliable player. 2, the distinctions. We might think that God wanted simply obedience to a set of rules, whereas what he really wants is people of a particular sort. 3, we might think that the virtues were necessary only for this world. That in the other world we could stop being just because there's nothing to quarrel about, and stop being brave because there is no danger. Now, it is quite true that there will probably be no occasion for just or courageous acts in the next world. There will be every occasion for being the sort of people that we can become only as the result of doing such acts here. I want to read that again. Now, it is quite true that there will probably be no occasion for just or courageous acts in the next world. But there will be every occasion for being the sort of people we can become only as a result of doing such acts here. The point is not that God will refuse you admission to his eternal world if you haven't got certain qualities of character. The point is that if people have not got at least the beginnings of those qualities, then no possible external condition could make a heaven for them. That is chapter 2, the Cardinal Virtues. Before we jump into chapter 3, are there any questions?
He has a really good way. I mean, as you talk through this stuff, verse after verse after verse,
Spring to mind?
Spring to mind, and he has disseminated it so well.
Yes.
And his gift seems to be take these huge concepts and make them very elementary and very easily understood.
Very articulate fella.
Well, not just articulate, but being able to
discerning,
disseminate all the concepts into such simplistic.
Did he come up with those 4 cardinal virtues? Or?
No, those are ancient. Those are at least to the apostles at Antioch, and potentially earlier than that. I don't know the origin of them. I know that the early church, when I think it was Augustine, made Christianity the Church of Rome, the official religion of Rome. It was already in place at that time. So, with that, I like those 2 chapters together. I think they pair really nicely together. Now, we're going to start chapter 3 on social morality, which we might call today better political or economic morality. So, this will be fun. Now, the first thing Lewis says is that Christianity does not have a detailed program on how to apply do to others as you would have them do to you. It is for all people at all times. And the specific political program you might enact at one point in time would not be appropriate at another. Right? That's not how it works. The Bible tells you to feed the hungry. It doesn't give you lessons in cooking. The Bible tells you to read the scriptures. It doesn't give you pointers in how to read Hebrew and Greek. Right? That comes down to Christians and the spirit inside them figuring out how to enact the broader decrees to the world at large in their particular instance. The next note Lewis makes is that a lot of people say that the church should lead. Lewis says it depends on what you mean by that. Right? If you think that we should have Christian virtues in, say, a trade union or in the field of education, then that is a job for Christian unionists and Christian teachers. If you want Christian literature, it needs to come from Christian novelists, not from the panel of bishops getting together and trying to write plays in their spare time. All right? If we want Christian virtues in our politics, then we need Christian politicians. We don't need to make high-up members of the clergy trying to be politicians. Now, we get into it. Lewis says the New Testament gives us some clear hints as to what a fully Christian society might look like. And Lewis says it might be too much for us to bear. So he says there's to be no passengers and no parasites. If a man doesn't work, he will not eat. It says everyone is to produce something good. Well, to have no silly luxuries or advertisements. In that sense, it would be what we now call leftist. In fact, you can make a biblical argument that a pretty strong one, that the apostles at Antioch were living in a socialistic community. Second, it insists on obedience and respect along the proper channels, from civilians to leaders, from children to parents, and Lewis says this is going to make me incredibly unpopular, from wives to husbands. Third, it's going to be a very cheerful society, full of singing and rejoicing. Now, if such a society existed today, we'd probably find it very odd. Economically, it would be very socialist, and so in that sense advanced. However, its family life and its code of manners would seem incredibly old-fashioned. We would all like little bits of it, but probably none of us would like the whole thing. We have a few side notes here. First is Lewis saying, I need to point out that the Jews, the ancient Greeks, and the early Christians all agreed that you shouldn't lend money with interest. That is the basis of our whole economic system of investment. Now, you could argue that perhaps Moses and Aristotle were thinking of private individuals. You lend money to me, you shouldn't charge me interest. Then that these early thinkers couldn't foresee things like the joint stock company and how complex they are. Lewis says, I don't know. That's not my job. That's the job for the Christian economist. He says, it's merely honesty that compels me to point out that 3 great civilizations have forbid what we've built our society on. Speaking of economics, the Bible says everyone must work so that they have something good to give to the poor. Now, some people say our job should be to create a society without any poor. Lewis says, perhaps they're right. That doesn't excuse you from giving in the meantime. If you think that because we're working to create a world with no poor, and that means you don't have to give in the meantime, that you've parted ways with Christian morality. Which then raises the question, how much? How much should you give? Lewis says, I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusements, etc., is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. If our charities do not at all pinch or hamper us, I should say they are too small. There ought to be things we should like to do and cannot do because our charity expenditures excludes them. I'm speaking now of charities in the common way. Particular cases that giving to the poor, particular cases of distress among your own relatives, friends, neighbors, or employees, which God, as it were, forces upon your notice, may demand much more, even to the crippling and endangering of your own position. For many of us, the great obstacle to charity lies not in our luxurious living or desire for more money, but in our fear of insecurity. We want to have a nice safety cushion in the bank account. We want to be safe. We want to be self-sufficient. We don't want to have to depend on God. And now, before I end, hello, you're late.
Yeah, I had a bad morning.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
God taught me a few things, and
Well,
He's going to teach God a few things too, because I broke something.
oh. And now, before I end, good time to get here.
Yes, I know. I wanted to come, but I needed to discuss some of this. That's why I decided to.
Lewis says, I'm going to venture a guess as to how this section has affected any who have read it. My guess is that there are some leftist people among them who are very angry that it has not gone farther in that direction, and some people of an opposite sort who are angry because they think it has gone much too far. If so, that brings us right up against the real snag in all this drawing up of blueprints for a Christian society. Most of us are not really approaching the subject in order to find out what Christianity says. We are approaching it in the hope of finding support from Christianity for the views of our own party. We are looking for an ally when we are offered either a master or a judge. Lewis says, and I'm just the same. There are bits in this section that I wanted to leave out. And that is why nothing whatever is going to come of such talks unless we go a much longer way around. A Christian society is not going to arrive until most of us really want it. And we are not going to want it until we become fully Christian. And so, as I warned you, we are driven on to something more inward, driven from social matters to religious matters. That is chapter 3 on social morality. Next week, we're going to cover chapter 4, and it's another kind of weird standalone chapter on morality and psychoanalysis. But then chapters 5 and 6, I think, pair together very nicely because chapter 5 is on sexual morality and chapter 6 is on Christian marriage. But for now, that's all I have to say about that.